Like, thank you, Igor. Seriously, like, this means a lot. And thank you for coming, and saying yes to this interview. I remember I saw your video on YouTube just abruptly. It's like, like, first time, not first time, but like, not many people talk about Tantra the way you actually talked about it, which I saw here, especially on this island in Kundalini, saying what has happened to Tantra. And I was furious, not more than furious. I was like, this is such a delusion. And I'm not a master, and neither I am an expert. So I wanted someone who has, insight into this and remove the delusion as much as possible, so that we can see clearly ahead of ourselves.
Well, yeah, wonderful. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Yes, so let's see what will unfold. I'm completely up for it. I'm looking forward to it. It's a subject that is dear to my heart. And hopefully, if some people will enjoy and benefit, then, then it's all worthwhile.
And do you want to give a little bit history about yourself? Like, I know that you have been a spiritual teacher for over a decade, and you have studied also with Maharishi Mahesh, I think, the Transcendental Meditation program.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's kind of, it will not be easy to give it all in a nutshell, but I'll try to give it as concise version as possible. I was born in Uzbekistan, which at the time when I was born was still part of the Soviet Union. And I've studied art from a very early age. In fact, I've attended a private studio of a local artist who was also a martial artist. He was poet and really gifted man, very, very charismatic. And so kind of he ignited that flame further, and passion for art. So I've pursued the art career as far back as I can remember myself. So that I've entered the art college and did all the professional training, 4 years in the art college first, and then Institute of Art and Theatre, again in Uzbekistan, and I served 2 years in military service. And then I embarked for my further studies in the Academy of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg. I never graduated. After approximately 2 years, I've left for Poland, and then shortly after, about under 2 years, to London. And for 10 years, I've pursued a career of an artist. And when it all kind of abruptly ended around my mid-30s, when I went through this profound transformation of consciousness, if we put it into this language. And although I always had this, what I later understood, what I meant is that throughout my youth, throughout my child years, I always had great fascination for all things that are otherworldly, not necessarily what we perceive with the senses and what's going on, although that was also always a great interest of mine in terms of the reality of this ephemeral kind of experience. So there were some, of course, events which were tragic as much as they were pivotal in my family, because I've lost my first daughter when she was only 6 years old in a car accident. So that prompted this kind of deepening. I went through a period of profound grieving, of course, but that grieving also had this flavor, and I've spoken about it on few occasions in a similar format of discussions, interviews, that it had something else that really struck me at the time, that quality that was sort of fundamentally turning me towards that what is real. And from there on, the search, of course, went really magnified. So by the time, and also I've learned along the way transcendental meditation. I did my practiced quite diligently for 5 years until finally I decided to attend this advanced program, which is known to the TMers as TMCD program. And it's a substantial course of 4 weeks where you learn the methodology of meditation with a different kind of approach other than most TMers or those who practice just 20-minute TM, right? Morning, evening. It's an advanced course, and the course is actually designed for enlivening activation of that dormant latent power, of which we will talk later on in this conversation, as far as I understood from your interests. So all that was already on the background of my memory in terms of these early years experiences, all these kind of involuntary movements, occasional kind of visions, visitations, insights, those many mini kind of shifts in perception that I went through. Because also it will be important to mention that by the age of 30, I've lived in 4 capitals and pursued the career of an artist and kind of led a very intense life, and in every respect of that term. My kind of formative years as an artist coincided with being in London in the 90s. And London was really hopping, it was happening, a lot was going on. And so that interest towards spirituality was always there, but kind of on the background of what was happening in my life, as probably with most people, until suddenly there was this, I would even say totally unexpected flip, where that was what was on the background became in the forefront of everything. And everything I knew about myself, including all this hooray, all this architecture and structure of identity, crumbled down, or at least fell back onto the background. So in the mid-30s, I went through this existential crisis head-on, faced with this, what loosely spoken in various traditions or by various teachers as that, dying before you die. It felt like that. Again, I've given quite a number of interviews. In fact, it's funny that you've asked me this question to give it a little background, because I haven't actually spoken about myself and story for a number of years. You see, so it's kind of like revisiting this, So, and then from there on, the process unfolded with intensity, ferociousness, violence. Violence, I would clarify this word, maybe term a little bit. Violence, not in a sense of violence as it is commonly understood in English language, but there is this, when we speak of awakening of that dormant power, tradition speaks of 3 general ways of how it unfolds. And the trajectory, actually, of the process very much linked to what and how it unfolds. So there is this middle way, there is this gradual, slow. There is this intermediate, and what the tradition called violent. Violent because it is accompanied by realignment of all these vital currents in the body in such way that the individual barely is able to keep up with the process, or to reinstate it, the physiology itself, the neurophysiology, is being able to catch up with what is happening in the midst of that transformation of individual consciousness as it as the as it kind of like opens itself out of that vintage point with the pop. And so there was this then a prolonged phase now of what I call spontaneous spiritual practice, known in the circles as sadhana. That sadhana unfolded from there, and it wasn't in any way kind of facilitated by an existing, let's say, teacher, guide, or references borrowed from books. We also should bear in mind that this was very early days of the internet. This is just that shift towards the internet begin to happen, but there would be nothing. There was like that at that time there was practically nothing. So, and I was not at all an internet guy, I was, kind of all down, hands down, kind of in terms of creation of the works of art. So really the looking up something like that wouldn't even dawn on me. So this spontaneity of the process was accompanied by profound internal insights, where I spontaneously also recognized the authority, that spiritual authority, in Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Maybe it would be good to add a little bit that personal touch is that my mother became TM meditator before myself, and she did that on her own accord completely, also following up that tragedy in the family. And she first expressed her interest in the teachings of Sri Aurobindo, this amazing encounter, as she was kind of became suddenly religious for a short period of time to kind of maybe help her to reconcile that personal loss of her granddaughter, my daughter. She was frequenting a local church back in Tashkent, where my mother lived when I was already living in the West, in London. So once she was walking out of that church, of that building, a man suddenly appeared and just thrusted into her hands this small book by French writer Sat Prem on the life of Sri Aurobindo. And of course it was in Russian. My mother read the book and immediately sent that book to me, and it kind of initiated her process. She then went straight and learned TM. Soon after, in fact, as soon as 1 month, she took that advanced course. Back in the days, it was all possible and allowed in the former Soviet Union countries, because the TM movement was eager to bring more advanced meditators into the world during that transitory phase. So Maharishi was particularly encouraging TM teachers to go into all these parts of the world where kind of gained independence and became countries in their own right. So my mother became all of a sudden this yogini, in her late age. And of course that relationship that I had as an only child and growing up without a father, it was a very intense relationship, kind of like push me, pull you, Also, there was a lot of space, geographical, emotional space, because I left home very early. I got married very early to begin with. I formed my family. I dissolved my first family. I gone into exploring this art career. So I wasn't even physically with her, but there was a very strong link, as you can understand, or anyone who knows thing or two in terms of the psychological setup. There was this mother-son dynamics playing themselves out, in fact, stronger in the later years. So I became meditator, just regular TM, actually only to give in to my mother's insistence, because I was initiated into meditation in a dream. And that mantra was whispered into me kind of through the top of my head, and I have began meditating and did that for 1 year until my mother said, well, you ought to get initiated and have access into tradition this is a proper way. And I simply succumbed to that and gave in to that, although I was quite kind of single-minded back then still. And so I'm saying all this so that there is a clarity also on the part of anyone who hears this, that my studies with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi were not as maybe with a lot of those who physically were in the presence. Of course, this was becoming more and more difficult because Maharishi was a world's guru. He had millions of followers around the world, huge, successful, and highly hierarchical organization. So, of course, to get close to Maharishi was practically impossible at the time when I would have loved to meet and just to pay respect, even if for a moment. So, but what happened instead is that in relationship got extremely internalized, and I began to receive guidance. And that guidance was coming, funny enough, through Maharishi's own teacher, whom he referred to as simple as Guru Dev. So that formative now years in terms of my spiritual practice, there was this guidance of that spontaneously unfolding process where I've meditated for hours every day. All my activity was subsided. I've stopped painting, I've quit art, I've quit all my social engagements and activity, and kind of found myself living a pretty much of a monk's life in the capital. And I got trapped, I'm saying that in inverted commas. I couldn't leave London because I didn't know where to go. And because of the kind of the economics of it all, it felt like, well, it's safer to stay because this is where I have my patrons, where I sold my art, where I kind of had my livelihood. So I remained in London, and in no time, 5 years went of that intense phase. So in the 6th year, I began coming out of that phase, and this culminated in some kind of more stable phases of integration. When I've met my now wife, who is from England originally, and her name is Amrita Mahadevi. She has asked me to rename her in a ceremony some years ago. We did that here at one of our retreats. So, and in no time, I'm sitting now speaking to you. I'm father of 3 children, 12 years old girl, 13 years old girl, the eldest, and the little one is just over a year old. So
what a journey.
Yeah.
What a journey it has been, yeah. And even when you had this awakening, it was you were not actually had any spiritual practice at that time. It was just came out of nowhere.
No, that not exactly. Not, I wouldn't say that. I was already a meditator.
Oh.
In fact, not just a meditator. I was already quite versed in Hatha Yoga. I've learned, studied it properly. I could probably have taught yoga asanas if this was my wish. I have studied at least the very, basics of some of these disciplines, such as Ayurveda, Stapatya Veda, Vastu, which is known as Vastu, right? The science of placement, the science of architecture. The basics of Jyotish, astrology, Vedic astrology. So kind of, because under the guidance of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, TM organization had all this information available through courses, through various kind of, through literature. And of course, I was a ferocious reader as well, so I would read a lot on the subject. So I wouldn't say that by the time this took place that I was kind of like not knowing what is happening. But no matter how much I read about it, no matter how much I've heard about it, no matter how much I kind of imagined it, it took me completely by surprise. And it took me completely under its own sway to such degree that I would have never imagined that this is actually possible. I'm not going to exaggerate, nor am I prepared to kind of underplay it.
Right. Yeah, because I have met a couple of people who have had these Kundalini awakenings, whatever the name we can assign to, and it was spontaneous and they didn't have the spiritual practice, and it became very difficult for them to integrate and also go through it, because it requires a certain kind of, I believe, a discipline and also a devotion, because I feel like without that, it's difficult to navigate these processes. So a lot of people kind of get lost because it happens out of nowhere. So yeah, glad that you had a journey, that you had a foundation altogether with TM, and then the meditation led to it, which seems to me like was a gradual process for you. So of course not easy, definitely not easy. Yeah.
Well, maybe I should add to that is that to what you have just said, how many people undergo these spontaneous awakenings today, and not just today, because it just happened that I've been working with a lot of people over the years who had this complete, unexpected, out of the blue awakenings years ago, decades ago. Some of them belong to more or less some kind of formal side of that spiritual training. So therefore, they would be better off or better fit to make sense of all this, what was happening to them. But there were also people who are now in their, I would say, 60s and 70s, who have never had any background. They come from a very different cultures, and largely these Anglo-Saxon cultures with strong kind of religious undertone, where Christianity is really the main archetypes. In other words, the archetypes belong to the Western world. So going through this would pose tremendous difficulty, also because they would not find any answer in the given social and cultural context, because awakening itself, awakening of this life force, of this dormant power, very often demonized, and from the religious perspective it is demonized, and from the psychological and psychiatric perspective it pathologized. So you kind of got stuck between this Scylla and Charybda, passing through that narrow passage to make sense out of it. And a lot of people, it's a big problem, in fact. What we're touching upon here is a massive problem which we are now collectively facing. So people who have dedicated their work, those who are now senior and kind of established speakers and peers in the field. I'm talking about someone like Stanislav Grof, who has coined that term, spiritual emergency, back in the days, have been calling for that complete reevaluation of what really is the borderline between what we call healthy, emotionally, psychologically individual versus when the psyche breaks down. Right. And the psyche breaks down, what do? Do we immediately begin to heal that psyche and apply some of these clumsy kind of methodologies and chemical substances? Or do we begin to recognize that this is part and parcel of greater maturity of the psyche, of the soul?
So now we are talking about the Kundalini awakening. So the Tantra, the path of Tantra, because I want to combine these two. For some people, yes, the Kundalini awakening can be spontaneous, but then there is a path towards self-realization, right? And there is a path of renunciation, and there is a path of Tantra. This is how I see it. But there's a lot of misconception about that path, especially in the Western world. There's misconception about yoga right now because of what has happened. There's many different kinds of yoga. Similarly with Tantra, which is a part of self-realization, it has kind of become about, if I may say, about sex and lust and all these like eye gazing, and it has lost its essential meaning. So like if someone wants to take this path of self-realization, and especially of Tantra, how do they go about? But before that, what itself is Tantra? Like what is it? Like I want people to be clear about that.
Well, okay, so it's a tricky one because one would, before one ventures into defining Tantra, it would be very, I think, helpful to put Tantra into a context of the greater culture where the term itself comes from, so that before we begin to define what Tantra is, because there are so many definitions, so many different ways of how that even term can be scrutinized etymologically. But I would like to maybe remind us that Tantra, as a set of methodologies, as an esoteric practice and philosophy, is inseparable from Vedas, from Vedic civilization. And there are voices out there among the scholars that Tantra is but a revival of the more ancient, earlier Upanishadic teachings. So with all this richness that Indian subcontinent is known for when it comes to matters of spirit, with various and variety of approaches. Let's not forget there are 1,000 names of Vishnu and 1,000 names of Shiva. There are like several million of different gods, right? There's something like that. It's so the Tantra itself is that kind of undercurrent, I would call it, an undercurrent that has always been there. And it's very easy to forget that Tantra in itself is a methodology. This is really the very essence of what it exemplifies. Therefore, it is not a surprise that some of the most well-known spiritual teachers who in the broad daylight would expound the teachings, let's say, known today as purely Vedantic, right? Like, let's say, the path of renunciation as it was taught by a venerated sage of the 8th century, Adi Shankara. Deep down, these sages, they also were versed and initiated into tantric rites and passages, and by day they would wear one cloak, by night they would relax, so to speak, like kind of leisurely speaking. They will take out, put their one hat off and wear another one. This is important realization, because that saves us from splitting the hairs where Tantra stands, where Tantra belongs and what its purpose. So, because a lot of conversation unfolds in that vein, and I myself gave due to that kind of analogy in the earlier years, when I would especially speak in the far west, in California, sort of to kind of bring these reminders, because at the time I felt that the prevalent teachings were overly dominated by nobody is at home, there's nothing, there's no body, there's no being, there's no human, there's no story, there's no nothing, that there's this kind of that life is an illusion, all this is not what it seems, it's just Maya, and therefore, so Brahman is the only reality. So I felt like to introduce this another perspective. I've often supplemented my discourses with this comparative analysis, because it was simply also kind of a trick, if you will, to give a mind another way of how to view this. But now I feel it's also equally important to bring this reminder that Tantra, it's indispensable and exists everywhere. Therefore, I also spoke about what really Tantra means, that if we understand that there can be so many different Tantras, not just Tibetan Tantra, right? As in Buddhist Tantra, like that. It can be, it can be, dare I say, Christian Tantra. It can be, Gnostic, can be Jewish Tantra. It can be Tantra in terms of shamanic traditions. So certainly, this tantric path, because it's a path, it's a distinctive way, is about working with the body. So maybe this is one of the main distinctions. Of course, what happened in the West, right from the get-going, and to what you have alluded to, is that only certain set of esoteric practices were picked and made all the emphasis on them. And let's not forget, this coincided with the West emancipating itself. It coincided with that whole movement of this growth, right, and expansion, rebellion, growth of political and social awareness. So there was this, we cannot view the way spiritual teachings and methodologies were utilized and used outside of the trends of time. So we know very well that the 60s, by the time the flower power and TM and all this Siddha Yoga and all the Hare Krishna and all this, Satchitananda Society and all these sort of like movements culminating with this greater political kind of awareness, people on the streets and kind of suddenly confronting the power, confronting the authority. So what probably caught the attention of a lot of teachers is that also fascination with that what maybe was for too long in suppression. And the sensuality was very much in suppression. So therefore I see this also as a not to kind of embellish this, but to justify why this formed part of that global process. It simply was not enough maybe yet, maybe wasn't the time, and maybe it wasn't meant to be given to, maybe it wasn't the teachers themselves, the instructors, all these populists, they themselves were using these tantric teachings to heal themselves, which is not at all uncommon. We know very well that some of the most dedicated psychologists to their job found their way into psychology because they had to deal with something that they had to come to terms with. So not unlike Mana here, those who have offered these spiritual teachings and just a sliver of that, what these teachings contain, under the guises of spiritual sex gurus, they themselves they were undergoing some kind of recovery, coming into terms with their own sensuality and sexuality. But of course, the label, that's maybe to wrap it up, the label and the reputation of what Tantra stands for, of course, suffered, because for a lot of people, especially lay people who don't have the time, know the access into tradition from another angle or viewpoint, they would end up with that very set of prejudices where Tantra is viewed as that kind of set of sexa yogic asanas, and the whole thing is about retreats where couples get together, and it's So of course we know that that's not only not true, it also the teaching that is presented upside down, because the tantric mysteries or tantric initiations begin from a very different place and culminate in some cases in the act where male and female counterpart enact the whole creation in that cosmic archetypes as Shiva and Shakti. But that happens only to those who have already reached profound level of expansion of consciousness, have complete control of the senses, certainly have the Kundalini fully awakened and risen, and without much of the psychological baggage still lay in the psychic centers. Because if this whole act can only be performed for what it is when these prerequisites are met.
Right, and because you said the prerequisites are met, because I feel what happened to that is the teachers started teaching Tantra to people who are not ready. Because I think for Tantra, you need to have some kind of spiritual foundation, because you are actually going to work with energy in your body and also with your desires. And if you're engaging in, let's say, the sexual activity, which is one maybe part of Tantra, it requires a certain set of pronunciation from your side, and also a detachment wherein it is not about my sexual lust or fulfillment of that, but it is more than that. And I think a lot of the teachers back in the 60s or 70s were teaching about these teachings to people who didn't have this spiritual foundation yet. You need to have some kind of meditation. I think it got lost in the ignorance of people when they received. And I think and that led to this movement of Neo Tantra, because it's also kind of, sometimes I feel it becomes a cover for our own desire to, spiritual cover.
Completely, it kind of becomes a handy justification for reveling in these desires, right. And it kind of gives that spiritualized perspective, which now when we kind of came to full circle and coming of age, I would say nowadays, in terms of all these different approaches that have been tried, and I'm now talking about really globally, not just particularly that aspect of Neo-Tantra. We're coming out of ages in terms of Neo-Advaita, non-duality, many other large spiritual movements that promised heaven on earth, and they promised enlightenment, and a lot of people gave their life and somehow did not exactly savor the fruits of these teachings fully, or to the degree to which it was promised. So it's a kind of coming of age now, the phase that I see it, where a lot more now people in the West speak about and focus on indigested, unprocessed, unmetabolized psychic material in the form of traumas. The shadow work has always been big ever since the days of early psychologists, going all the way back to Carl Jung, with his dream psychology interpretation and so forth. So that justification in the name of spiritual practice, in the name of realization, is a very well-known phenomena, not just in Neo-Tantra in terms of how one can revel in desires in the name of God, or in the name of Shakti, in the name of Goddess, in the name of self-realization or great knowledge. But there is a lot of also coping out when we see that in other spiritual communities, in these perspectives where dismissal of that what forms the very essence of human condition, when that is dismissed, of course, then it's a terrible spiritual bypassing. So it's an interesting time. So when it comes to Tantra, what I myself have noticed when I began to teach, and first I began to teach almost shortly after coming out of that phase, and people were coming, of course, and I was even surprised that how it would happen, because there wasn't really this conscious act of sharing or teaching. But when that decision was made really consciously in 2008, when Maharishi Mahesh Yogi left this body, and it kind of came to me in a certain kind of very direct and clear way. I have noticed how some of the loftiest concepts in Tantra have been grossly misinterpreted and misunderstood and latched onto so as to, not to do the real work, not to really get engaged in what this process is inseparable from. So I've observed that firsthand, and that, of course, is a stuff of all teachers. It's a stuff of all learning, because teacher learns just as much, if not more, when they begin to teach. Teachers learn in the act of teaching. Their learning maybe have a different curve than those who assume the role of seekers or disciples or followers. But what I have realized over the years is how some of these very important tenets of Tantra, especially with regard to that Tantra is all about all embracing. It's the path of saying yes to life, to world, to senses. Senses are seen as the windows or doorways of perception. And likewise, they can be turned into portals. So, and then with this other kind of also very, very, very subtle way, in the way that we live in a culture which glorifies individual. How what really attracted me back in my own days, because I hope we can come back to this and talk, because it would be interesting to maybe touch up on why Kashmir Shaivism became the focal point of my teachings, why that became an umbrella. So these teachings that are ingrained and kind of make this philosophy into a uniquely standing one, often being immediately taken by that very same egoic structure, only to utilize it for remaining in a status quo, whereas the whole point of that emphasis which Tantra of Kashmir Shaivism speaks of as that universal egoity is the other way around. I will speak about it a little bit more, hopefully throughout our conversation. But just going back to this interest and how did I find my way to Tantra of Kashmir Shaivism, is because I didn't, let's make it very clear, I didn't study Kashmir Shaivism and that became the methodology of self-transformation. It's the other way around. It's finding through the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism the most fitting and comprehensive elaboration of what I was already going through, experiencing, realizing, and having direct insight. So it was a kind of, if you will, confirmation of that what I knew before the birth of time. It was a confirmation of that what I knew even when there was no language to express it. I want to make it very clear again, because self-realization is characterized by this unique feature, and you know that that is true because it is shared practically by all those who speak about it when asked. And it is this one feature, unmistakably, clearly show itself again and again in every account, is that upon this complete self-revelation, when this major shift in perception takes place, what you realize there and then, that that's what you have always been. That's why it's called awakening in the first place. Because it's not waking up to another reality. It's not some kind of a next level of reality, although that also can be spoken of, on the way to that self-realization, because as our consciousness begins to expand, our perception begins to expand. And with the expansion of our perception, the range of our experience becomes wider, richer, more refined. But here, what I speak to, is that very clear as a day, that that's who I am, who I always was. And it's a staggering realization. It can be, of course, accompanied by sometimes very funny phenomena, like you roll on the floor from that realization, and colics, because that laughter, that hysterical, for no reason laughter, also is a way that a residue of that contraction is being sweated out of your cells. It begins to pour out of you because it's been contracted, coagulated for so long. You've been carrying that kind of burden of being somebody, something. And then suddenly, when it opens up, you know yourself for who you are. And then, soon as you know yourself for who you are, you know that that's who you have always been, because it's not a new experience. It's most intimately familiar experience there is. Fundamentally, no other experience can come closer to that what is essentially knowing who you are and have always been. This is a mark of true self-realization. Yes, there are then further gradations of expansion of consciousness. We might talk about it later if you will, but just to say, this feature makes suddenly your whole entire life, or puts your whole entire life into a completely different perspective. And that perspective also suddenly unleashes those moments when you knew yourself for who you are, even if at that time it was a miss. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Repeat that one, like even if at that time it was a miss, like...
For instance, you know that as a child you had plenty of this spontaneously abiding and knowing that. Later on, when you thought you are daydreaming or daydazing or somewhere spaced out, this was exactly what it was. You know when you lost yourself in the act of something, be it an act of swimming or painting, lovemaking, running, getting lost, completely being amazed in the marvelous and magnificence of nature. During the time when the earth shakes or when the lightning strikes, you realize that that is always there, you see? But in those moments, you have a glimpse, maybe an insight, that momentarily kind of lit by that what is obvious. But when that shift takes place, then you realize that that's been available throughout your entire life, but simply gone amiss. It was missed because immediately or shortly after, mundane experience or mundane level of consciousness with all its opaque qualities will take over. So this is where I have, when I stumbled on the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism through, first and foremost, reading the books of Swami Muktananda. And it is through Swami Muktananda that I have discovered, or for the first time, in fact, heard the term Kashmir Shaivism. And from there on, there was no stopping. In that one single year, I remember recalling that I think I've read something like 12 or 14 scriptures, all from that tradition. And there was this, of course, realization upon realization, tweaking, the last bit of the jigsaw is put into place. There's something that also made me an avid lover of that philosophy, because I've realized that I've always been, all my life, very much made by that. I'm like a walking, living, breathing exponent of that, what Kashmir Shaiva philosophy in its essence is about. And that's what drew me so closely to that. Because, and let's not forget that within the Kashmir Shaivism, there are, of course, different veins, there are different distinctive schools, and they are not all the same, they're very distinctly different. But there are some examples, sages who kept that tradition alive. And within that tradition, something to my sensibility of being an artist, I found direct answer. It's like I've joined again a kind of really, really long forgotten family. And that felt very much at home. So the Kashmir Shaivism is not just, it's not something as a kind of a scholarly interest. I should have maybe said right at the start of this interview, when you have expressed this wish to speak, and the idea to speak about Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism, that I'm not a scholar. I don't qualify to teach Kashmir Shaivism, nor do I wish to, because what I teach is science of self-realization, because it is a science, and Kashmir Shaivism is notorious for making it, or rather perfecting that science to something extraordinary, something so extraordinary that even some of the great Indian sages and poets were referring to Kashmir Shaivism as the greatest kept secret, in India's greatest kept secret. I think that was Rabindranath Tagore. Or there's another reference to, I think that might be by Ananda Kumaraswamy, that the Kashmir Shaivism is the best, culmination of all what happened in India. So of course, there was this also excitement gave way to deep appreciation, deep respect for a tradition which is kind of also amazing. Why would this tradition become so popular in our day and age? Because this is another very interesting phenomenon, how Kashmir Shaivism, even 10 years ago, very few people even have heard about the term. But I gradually were noticing how in these last 20 years of my life, how the interest towards Kashmir Shaivism grows year by year, and how many peers in the field will begin to add that into their CVs so as to be associated. You see, so there is another side to that popularity.
Right. I mean, everything becomes a fad also, and one wants to take that bandwagon per se.
Yes, that also happens.
Definitely. Yes, yes. But I think with Kashmiri Shaivism, what I see from Advaita and Kashmiri, Advaita is actually reject everything. It makes everything as an illusion, and only the real thing is Brahma. And I think with Kashmiri Shaivism, it puts that even this bottle is Shiva. So everything is Shiva, and we are all part of that. And Shiva is experiencing itself through us, and also it emphasizes on the energy aspect of consciousness, which I think Advaita doesn't recognize. And the path become in Advaita very intellectual, and people get lost in the intellectualization of who am I, rather than the experience of that Shiva itself. So I think that's what Kashmiri Shaivism gives, that the flavor of the fullness, that there is an energy that we cannot negate and ignore. And even the Kundalini, which I think a lot of Advaita teachers just, we're not going to talk about Kundalini, it's not important. But I think as in the path of self-realization, it's inevitable that the Kundalini awakening is going to happen. And coming back to that self-realization path and Tantra, like Tantra is one part of self-realization. That's why we are taking this spiritual path, right? So, but how do we know we are ready for Tantra? And if we are ready, then where to go? Because there's so much noise and there's so many retreats, there's so much out there. It's easy to get lost, and also even to discern, like, is it me that thinks that is ready, or it's my ego that because it's popular and I'm going on to this. When should a student take this path of Tantra? Like, and how does they know, and where to, like, if they want to?
Mm. Well, maybe it will be fair to say that this dilemma has always existed. So it's not just the dilemma of our day and age. This dilemma of readiness, qualification, and appropriateness has always been there. And not surprisingly, tantric teachings learned, or rather tantric teachings found a way around it, so that not to disclose the deeper aspects of esoteric teaching, which is known as rahasaya, that internal aspect of the teaching. And a compromise was found so that it still remains pretty much a householder religion, or householder path, or householder philosophy. Whilst at the same time, the real refined aspects of the teachings would only be disclosed, shared with, transmitted to the one who is ready to receive these teachings. It was back then, or true to that time, true to our time. This is why also, this explains why all tantric scriptures, shastras, put together will not give you a full insight into the process of Kundalini. There's not one single coherent enough scripture out there that gives the fullness of that process opened like this for someone to partake, because tantric tradition or tantric path have always been heart-to-heart transmission. In that respect, tantric tradition is very close to something which among many other spiritual traditions have an element of, but do not have it to this degree, as it does in Sufi path. In Sufi path, it has the same, like this is where Tantra and Sufism are very much share that territory. Because there are a lot of esoteric manuals, there are a lot of amazing expositions. But one can read, the most important text that Rumi left behind, not the famous poems translated by Coleman Barks and recited by famous people today, But the real work, where the real teaching is disclosed, is called Manavi i Masnavi. Masnavi i Manavi, sorry. Masnavi i Manavi. Masnavi va Manavi. Yeah. It's a work that Rumi left behind. He worked on it 20 years of his life, well after the whole encounter with Shams. And read that. It's all poetic verse. It's very difficult to extract anything unless you are initiated into the tradition to such degree where you will be given access to that metaphor, language, meter, everything. And yet, there is a term that, that last work of Rumi is a Quran in Persian language, the importance given to that work. The same we can find in all the work out there. Every gloss given by a master on a particular scripture, and we know that Kashmir Shaivism teaches, and they traditionally following that very, very, giving due to the tradition, they gave their assessment and commentaries to existing scriptures. And not just scriptures which have been considered exclusive to Shaiva tradition, but even those who are kind of globally known as more Vedantic teachings. Thus we have Abhinavagupta's commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, for example. And yet, with all that wealth of information, no one can learn about this process, because this process can be learned only firsthand with a qualified teacher. And if this qualified teacher is not an adept and not a real master, then it's a very dangerous thing to do, because Tantra deals with very, very powerfully transformative methodology. And when we speak about this methodology, we speak about working with life force. It's like working with nuclear energy. It's dangerous. It's not at all a trivial affair. So, of course, we also live in time, and our time is not different from all the times in terms of why would people want to partake in these teachings. You'd be surprised how in the earlier days I would be reached out by people who have succeeded perhaps in certain professions where that kind of taking bulls by the horn was part and parcel of how you make it there. Let's say if you worked in finances, if you were a stockbroker, and suddenly that you kind of now pursuing the path of self-realization, you want to get enlightenment, you want to go shortcut. I would have a first session like you and I speak now, and the person would be asking me, can you teach me that, Kikari Mudra, for example, because they found their way, it's all available, it's all out there. So like, okay, so I want to know how to milk the holy cow, and you don't even know what to say to these people, because naivety, of course, and being gullible to such degree where this boldness expresses itself in the way where, first of all, you would need to sit this person down and allow them to cool off, so that then you can make a real fire. Because otherwise it's all that lower heat, and lower heat can only bring about the activation of the lower Kundalini. So in tantric work, and Kashmir Shaivism in particular, or Trika Shaivism in particular, as it is also known to scholars, these parameters, these prerequisites have always been known and can never be abandoned in favor of so-called age of democracy, where everything belongs to everyone, because that's what a lot of Westerners think. It's a very Western mentality that everything belongs to me. In fact, maybe even more so Anglo-Saxon mentality, that if I was born in that privileged part of the world, it never questions that I'm already belonging to a certain tradition just because I want to. Teach me, take me, I want to. And it's like, this is where, and when we say Western, of course, a lot of people who are born and raised in Orient, Asia, India, Far East, many of younger generations also have been affected by that, or yes, infected by that bug, by that disease. However, the core, or rather that more genetic predisposition in people who come from the cultures where there have always been healthy respect for how things done, and also a kind of a lived wisdom where it's not about give it to me now, no matter what, because I want it. So there is this a greater maybe sensitivity as well. Whereas when we speak about how the popularization on one hand and availability of these teachings now make it a formidable combination where it makes it irresistible. So people want to experience it and have the best of both worlds. Somehow that even whole concept of enlightenment gained that kind of an air of accolades, of something that you add to your CV. Right? It's like, I am this and this and this and that, and I'm enlightened, So therefore, of course, when we speak about, and you also mentioned a lot of things in what you have said earlier, that I absolutely agree that not only, maybe I just want to tweak that part about, not only Kundalini is part of the process, inevitable, it's more than that. Kundalini is the only power of transformation, behind the transformation. There's nothing else. But of course, when we say Kundalini, that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. This is why the course that I am launching, we're about to launch, and it's going to be a 3-month course, which is a kind of a result of many, many, many years, decades of work, where I would like to put something, maybe for the very first time. I don't want to insist, I don't know exactly if some other people are working on this at the same time. It is possible. But what it became clear to me that there is a great bias within the spiritual community when it comes to what actually drives the process. And Kundalini is the very power of self-actualization, because Kundalini is, in the first place, the reason for this human experience. Without Kundalini, there will be no human experience whatsoever. So the two are intimately interconnected. Consciousness coiled to itself produces the phenomena of individual experience. So therefore, uncoiling of that force is the only power that can take one beyond this experience, because it doesn't belong to me or you. So, yes, it is bizarre how in many spiritual circles today, the dismissal of the energetic transformation, that somehow through mental modifications, through mental intellectual insights, we can arrive at the realization of who we are, and that's what non-duality essentially is. It's a continuous loop, which in fact is a cul-de-sac. And of course, it has outstanding teachers. And those outstanding teachers sooner or later realized that it doesn't lead anywhere, and began finding a way how it can be made into a teaching. Because by declaring there's nothing, and you cannot do anything because you're already not there, and it's nothing. And because every question, you can't even accept anything because that would presuppose that there is an entity, there's this agent who accepts or rejects. And this goes ad infinitum, this process of deduction. You see? And that process of deduction doesn't take seekers anywhere. In my view, it's a complete waste of time. But I find a lot of people are fascinated by this because there is this still, well, maybe, let me rephrase that before I even begin to what I see is there is this two reasons for such popularity of this kind of teachings, where nothing to teach, there's no teacher, there's no giver, no receiver, there's no possibility of spiritual transmission because that presupposes two. There is nothing to realize because what you are is already all there is. All these tenets and propositions, right? We know they come from, of course, Advaita Vedanta, but they have been turned upside down, and they also been given to a very different treatment. But the popularity is because a lot of spiritual seekers out there have burned themselves out. They are what I call jaded seekers. They are tired. They have been at it for long enough, but haven't really experienced anything. And this seems to be like the ultimate way out, because it is in human nature not to abandon the search. That flicker of the hope that I've put so much time and effort, and yet still, if I'm really honest with myself, I'm nowhere closer to truth than I was 5 or 10 years or 20 years ago. Or I'm still carrying this whole gamut and baggage of my humanity, and it's not an easy one to carry. So this is another honest admonition. Therefore, this philosophy of there is no being and all your suffering therefore is a bogus, nothing ever has happened, is a kind of a possibility of a easy cop-out. But it doesn't happen, you see. Momentarily, someone who suffers, you can tell them, no, don't worry, this toothache is not happening to you. Take a pill and it will go. So, and on the other hand, this is this kind of being tired from seeking. Because let's face it, a lot of people out there, but it's not guaranteed that everyone really gets to the transformative or methodologies that are actually working, as opposed to just being exposed to these satsang dialogues or monologues. And then another side of the popularity of these teachings is precisely because it's tailored to that very wish of an individual to have its cake and eat it too. You see? Because there is nothing that one needs to sacrifice, nothing that one needs to give oneself to. There is no tapas, no tapasya, no sadhana. See? So it's perfectly tailored for that infantile Western mind, which is impotent, has depleted in a lot of ardor, that healthy, strong, spiritual ardor exemplified in that internal spark, fire.